Craig, really appreciate you spending a bit of time with us today. Looking forward to hearing your insights to church planting from around the world. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. If we go back, I grew up as an atheist, grew up in Los Angeles, California. If you've ever flown into LA International Airport, you almost landed right on the house I grew up in. Became a Christian my first year at university. Jesus movement, very exciting. Began to sense God leading me into ministry. And the first church I attended was a church plant. When, as a new Christian, we were involved. And then when I was in seminary, I was involved in a student group that was planting a church nearby. Before we went into mission work in Europe, was involved in was a church planter in the Chicago suburb for a few years. And then we were involved, we were 21 years in Germany, and most of those years were in church planting. So we were involved in starting directly about 4 different churches, and then the last years I was there got into a lot more consulting and church planter training, mobilization, and theological education, and then ended up returning to the States in 2002. And since returning to the States, teaching at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, I still spend about 25% of my time traveling internationally, doing a lot of consulting and teaching, and most of that is church planter training, church planter consulting with national movements and that sort of thing. So that's just a little background on me.
So thinking about your experience, you're planning in North America and also planning in continental Europe. Sort of where's your heart lie? Does it lie in both places, or have you still got a passion for North America, a passion for overseas cross-cultural church planting?
Well, no, I still have a passion for church planting. I'm excited about it wherever it happens. We've helped our local church here to start a multi-site. I guess I get most excited probably when I'm traveling more. I go back every summer and teach in Germany, and so keep in touch there. But there's some pretty exciting things happening in the majority world these days that I get to see and take part in. So I'm kind of passionate wherever I happen to be at the moment. So
reflecting on what you've seen around the world, what does the Western sort of church planting scene have to learn from church planting that's taking place around the world? So in Europe and also in the 2/3 world and the 1040 window.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think there is a temptation to go and try and discover the silver bullet. We hear about these sensational movements in India, Nepal, or Latin America, and we think, well, if we can just kind of figure out how they did it and come and do that in Western cultural context, then somehow we can make that happen. And that's a big mistake. Ultimately, of course, these movements are an act of God, a sovereign act of God, but live in different cultural contexts. And the key is not so much imitating as applying some of the same principles, but to a unique context. So to the original question, what can we learn? I think one of the things that really stands out to me as I look at what's happening in the majority world, and whether this is a rapidly growing movement or a slow growing movement, for the most part, they are Christians, that is, are a small minority and very often working and living in hostile environments. Now, in Western culture, we have had a Christian heritage. It's been nominal a lot, but we've had, nevertheless, more or less a Christian-friendly context within which to work, or at least a fairly tolerant context within which to work. And now, of course, we're realizing how rapidly that is changing. Not only secularization, but certainly the view that religious intolerance is the ultimate sin. And so to have a fairly evangelical approach to our faith, which calls people to become followers of Christ and to proclaim the unique we're finding ourselves in an environment. So it's happening in the majority world. I see the willingness to engage a hostile joy with confidence, willing to pay the price. So I think that's not really a method like for church planting, but it's certainly a spirit, an attitude, we're going to need more of that, because I see sometimes when I look at our churches in the West that we're losing ground, or that we're not having the voice in the public sphere like we used to, and I think we just got to get over it. We better get over it and just get back to basics and be bold. So that's the first thing I want to learn from the majority world.
So reflecting on some of those principles, then, what do you think are the key principles that every church planner, should be thinking about and seeking to address as they build whatever structure or system or style of of church?
Yeah, and again, just sort of building a little bit on what we might learn from the majority world. Bold, joyful, humble proclamation of the gospel, unashamed, but not arrogant. I think that's just basic to the very inherent to the nature of the gospel itself. And, it's the gospel, which is the power of God unto salvation. That's pretty basic, but I do think sometimes we're a little bit intimidated by our world. Another thing which I think is a real key is lay mobilization. This is not only a feature of rapidly growing movements, but particularly where resources are scarce, it's pretty obvious you either mobilize lay church planners, so-called tent makers, or it's not going to move forward. And I think because in the West we've had a lot of resources, we've tended to be very resource dependent. And quite frankly, I think that has actually backfired a little bit. One of the interesting things that we're finding out, at least in North America, is it's often studies seem to show that those church planners who are going out with less subsidy, where they have to be raising their own support, they have to be enlisting their workers, they actually tend to be more effective than those who go out that have a denomination or a church that's sort of paying the way and giving them this huge launch team. So it's that step of faith. It's that willingness to step out, take risk, I guess. And that, along with that, goes the willingness to sacrifice. It's no fun. I was a tent-making church planter in the first church I planted in the United States. It's no fun, and I've attended a church where the leader was a lay person who wasn't theologically sophisticated. It's not a picnic. It's not a cure-all, but to, at least in the launch phase, the mobilization of lay people, to me, is a real key. We see this in the majority world, and here and there we're seeing it more and more in Western circles, but I think we've had a tendency to depend a little too much on well-educated, well-resourced, large launch teams, etc., and that's not always been necessarily the key. Those are two things that stand out. Maybe one other final thing which goes hand in hand with that, and that's the principle of empowerment. I find it fascinating when you look at the work of the Apostle Paul. If you go through his list of co-workers, many of them are identified from their church of origin. So you've got Timothy coming from the church in Lystra, for example. Almost all of Paul's co-workers were recruited from the churches he planted. He didn't say, wow, look at these great open doors. I better go back to Antioch and recruit a couple more church planting. Now, I'm not saying that'd be a bad thing to do, but he was, what we say, recruiting from the harvest for the harvest. And so, again, getting into mobilizing ordinary folk, lay people, empowering them, equipping them, releasing them for ministry. Now, eventually you have to have an infrastructure that's going to give them good theological training and skills to make sure those movements are healthy and reproducing and sustainable. But I think that's another important principle we find in Scripture. We see it in places in the majority world a little more than we do in Western circles.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I guess you spoke earlier when we were chatting about Bulgaria, and you spoke about the explosive church over there, saw 10,000. A church grow from very small to 10,000, and then over time, the church reduced in size. So there's a need to, obviously, as you say, mobilise lay people, empower them, see church planting, I guess, from that small phase, the lounge room phase, which really forces the church planter, as you say, to sacrifice, to raise funds, but really to do mission quickly. I think I see sometimes with a large core group. often what takes place is you start doing church, and by that I mean, the Sunday gathering or all the elements of, caring for, for believers, which, vital and important, and want to see people mature in Christ. But one of the exciting things about church planting is that, it forces you to be intentional about mission, especially when you turn up and there's no one in the room, or, you are in your lounge room and you're looking around thinking, wow, we want to do more. So I agree wholeheartedly with the desire to start small, start with resources that are coming from a number of sources, but not just one big source that'll run out. Yeah.
And I think that what you touch on there, I think I heard you in another interview or somewhere talking about evangelizing churches into existence. I like that phrase. In the majority world, and frankly, in Europe, I'm not that familiar with Australia, but it's probably a little closer to the Europe than the United States. When we went there to plant a church, you either evangelized or you didn't plant a church. Mm-hmm. At least in the States, if you've got good advertising and a fairly decent program and good preaching, you can probably get a church going without necessarily being very evangelistic. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but that's not my vision for church planting. And I think, again, that's one thing that's going to start becoming harder and harder, even in the United States. We have to be much more intentional about evangelism. Bob Roberts, who's written other nice books on church multiplication, one of the things he's advocated, and this has been something we've observed also with others, the Hill Country Church in Austin, Texas, they're saying, look, don't be so much concerned about a mother church getting this large core group that's going to survive and then sending out this huge team with 50 people, 100 people to plant the church, because what you're essentially doing is you're just kind of recreating church, which is tending to be then not as evangelistically focused as meeting the needs of those believers. They're saying, look, get a small commando unit, a missional team, a smaller team, and then build your core from the community you're trying to reach. And one of the things that Hill Country has done, they have a standard more or less for their church planting interns. It's an in-church, I think they call it residency, where they train up a half dozen or so church planters. And they want to see those planters, before they're released to actually plant, they have to build a list of hot contacts with non-Christians in the community, and really evidence they're able to build relationships with unbelievers. They're able to really connect with the community as one of the key milestones, whether this person is really going to plant an evangelistically driven church or just sort of gather the saints. So I think, again, those are some of the really key things, principles. They're biblical principles that we've got to kind of keep rediscovering.
You're touching on a really a key area that I'm interested in terms of what are the competencies, or what are the what are the convictions that a church planter has? What's the character traits they need to have, and then what are the skills they need to have to actually get a church going? What are the 3 or 4 skills you've touched on? Obviously the evangelistic ability in terms of heading out and getting contacts and starting to see fruit. What else do you see as an important skill for a church planter?
I use the word empowerment, and I've been on a couple of these church planting assessment interviews, and there's different ways to do it, but to look for people who are not just do-it-yourselfers. I think there's a temptation, because church planters tend to be highly motivated. They tend to be D sort of personalities, if you're familiar with that. They want to get the job done, and it's quicker and easier to do it myself and do it right. And that can get a church plant off the ground quicker in the short term. But if you want to get to reproduction or even multiplication, you have to be an empowerer. And if that's not who you are, you better get somebody on your team fast and early who will be an empowerer. Otherwise, that church is only going to grow as big as you are gifted. And so I think that the other really key one, the one is the ability to relate to unbelievers and build those kind of relationships. The other is going to be the readiness and willingness and the vision to empower others to do ministry, even if they can't do it as good as I can. So that's a really key thing I look for in assessing church planners. We're talking here about lead church planners. There's going to be others who are team members and so on, but certainly the leader has to lead the way in that.
Great. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today, Craig, and looking forward to your visit in Australia in a few weeks. And
I am too. My first visit.
Can't wait to hear more of your insights into church planning from Europe, from North America. God bless.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks for spending some time with us.
Okay. Good to talk.